Hey everybody, how's it going? Before we get into today's video, I want to ask to see if you're subscribed real quick. If you're not, it's free and it will let you know whenever we post new videos. Without further ado. Neela was many things. A Grundari, though that meant fairly little to her. It merely explained why she had lavender skin, long green hair, a pair of arms, legs, and 10 fingers. She was young, only 7 or 8 standard galactic years. There was no way to be entirely certain. Her youth chiefly related to being small, enhancing her ability to hide and go unnoticed. A trait that had failed her in the end. In this exact moment, she was cold, cramped, hungry, and afraid. That combination of feelings was almost comfortable for their familiarity. A familiarity bred from the last thing that defined so much of her life. Neela was a slave. Slavery was, to most of the galaxy, a legally gray area. The Gurungurun, a sickly green spheroid race who propagated via cloning, considered defective clones to be little more than organic drones. The insectoid Catalans have indentured debtors to use as living data servers to support their extensive augmented reality. Neela has kept company with slaves of every species in the galactic arm, except for one. The first time Neela met a human, it wasn't the comfortable, standard fear that she clutched in her chest like a favorite blanket. It was a terror, the likes of which she had scarcely thought possible. Just before it happened, she was in her pen, a cramped box made from steel bars. The rest of the ship's dark, wet cargo space was filled with similar pens. Nearly 100 boxes in all, stacked 5 tall. About a third of them bore residents, and a jagged walkway wove down the middle of the room. The sound of quiet chewing echoed around. In Neela's hand was her cut of a past-ripe Tardari squash. The fruit split between her and a handful of others in the cargo hold with her. She debated eating it, not because the moldy food would make her sick, but because she knew she wouldn't get anything later. Eventually, she slid her offering into a pocket that she had painstakingly hidden in her smock. If she could debate about it, she wasn't hungry enough yet. No sooner had she stowed the meal did Uncle Glees come waddling out of his quarters. While he was a Grundari like Neela, he was nobody's uncle. It's what he insisted the younger slaves call him. Where Neela's skin clung to her bones, his browning purple skin was stretched over a grotesquely well-fed form. Neela thought he looked akin to a half-melted candle. "Neela," he said in a sing-song voice that sounded the way Grease felt. "I have a customer who wants something a bit on the fresher side." He opened her pen, ushering her out. As it always did, the idea of running rose and died in the same heartbeat. The ship was large, hosting a half-dozen slavers in their stock, but not so large for her to get lost. And then there was the brand, a nanite tattoo on her neck spelling out her name. Glees casually moved his hand over the wrist device that would activate the disciplinary apparatus. She hurried out before he decided to encourage her with the spine-rending pain the nanomachines could create. "Good girl," he said, grabbing her by the arm to lead her back to his office. His office was a converted shuttle that also doubled as his quarters and showroom. It was while approaching this room that the humans struck. Alarms blared across the ship, which shook so violently that Neela was cast down to her knees. Glees steadied himself on a pen, looking around as though the source of the alarm could be found with such a simple inspection. "What in the gleft?" he began, but was cut off when an armored fist rocketed through the door at the far side of the cargo hold. The plasti-steel bent like foil, peeled away as a human tried to get in. Glees, for all of his many, many vices and failings, was no fool. He knew there was no fighting that thing, and there was no point in trying to save any of his stock, aside from the one he had to hand. Neela's feet left the floor as Glees hauled her in a mad dash for his only avenue of escape. The sound of metal groaning and shifting chased the pair as Glees moved faster than Neela had ever seen before. They made it to the shuttle, and she was unceremoniously dumped in a storage bin as he rushed to the cockpit. "Glees, what's going on?" came a distorted voice from the view screen. "Human raid!" Glees shouted back, bringing his shuttle to life in a way it hadn't experienced in cycles. Still, it responded, the port shutting and the engines spooling up. Neela watched as the human tore the outside airlock doors free, sending damage warning alarms through the vessel, giving her a clear view of the raider. It looked like a Grundari, like her, but massive, wearing thickly plated armor. The The couplers disengaged and the engines fired. They didn't move. The monstrosity chasing them held onto a protruding chunk of the hull. Glee's cursed before the thrum of the jets doubled. With a screech of tearing metal, the shuttle lurched free, leaving the larger craft. As soon as they were a light second away, they jumped into the small subspace channel the slavers had long since mapped as an emergency escape route. Neela didn't move from that small box for the entire trip in subspace. Glees was angry. He hadn't stopped cursing, running around the shuttle to keep the poorly maintained vessel from losing atmosphere or power. As a slave, Neela didn't understand much about technology. Still, she imagined a human peeling a chunk of the hull away wasn't a good thing, even to a well-kept vehicle. The ramshackle state of this barely functioning hunk of metal had Glees busy working, and he hated working. So, to be spared his ire, she stayed small and quiet. A delusional part of her hoped that she would just go unnoticed, even after the trip was done. That old Uncle Glees would overlook that she existed. A hope that tiptoed very quietly, very cautiously into her heart as time went by. Through the groaning of the ship decompressing into real space, she stayed undisturbed. Then the curses as Glees slapped the emergency weld putty on the shuttle. Then the clunk and skidding sensation of coming to a shuddering halt in a docking bay. He had a lot going on. He could forget about her, right? Unfortunately, Neela was pretty much the single resource Glees had to his name. So when the engines powered down, the first thing to happen was a plump purple fist wrapping around Neela's arm.
"Come on,"
he wheezed, hauling her from the cramped bin. She fell to the floor of the shuttle's cargo space among discarded ration packs and soiled clothes. Her limbs didn't want to move, spending too long disused in an unaccommodating box. Glees took this as a defiance and pressed his wrist control with a frustrated glee. Neela spasmed on the decking, suddenly glad she hadn't eaten as her stomach convulsed. Every nerve burned, lit by a million tiny fires. Her teeth clenched around a scream that she wanted to let fly, but the pain clamped it in her lungs. After a year of agony compressed itself into 3 seconds, Glees let up.
"Move!"
he ordered. Neela, trying her best to work through the sobs, got to her hands and knees. In the reflection of the airlock window, she saw his hand hover over his wrist. She clambered, numb, awkward, but with all haste to her feet. He considered her, assessing, clearly displeased.
"Put this on."
With a flick, he tossed her an old shirt. She didn't hesitate, the oversized garment fitting her like a dress. With the addition of a belt, a few small bracelets, and some massive shoes, Neela looked less like a slave than a merely impoverished whelp.
"It'll have to do,"
Glees griped.
"Listen, Neela, this is a Grundari station. You'll see a lot of our species here. Now, technically, owning you is illegal. So for now, we're gonna have to act as though I'm your actual uncle."
Eager to quash any hope before it had the audacity to take root, he added,
"Nobody here will even pretend to care that you're my property, Neela. Even if they did, all I have to do is set your brand on full and it would turn your spine to mush. Your corpse wouldn't be able to testify. I'd be out of what few credits I could squeeze from you, but I'm a resourceful guy. Me staying out of jail is more important than you staying alive."
Glees said it all as though commenting on the weather, and Neela believed him. Satisfied, the pair left the shuttle. Glees spoke to somebody about having it repaired, the rates, the time frame. Neela was too busy gawking at everything around them. There was a thin layer of grime on every surface, this being the least expensive docking port on the station. But it was so much cleaner than she'd thought possible. The space, too, was amazing. A ceiling tall enough to accommodate a dozen ships, people milling about, and the smell. Her stomach growled at the aroma coming from a handful of food stalls lining the far wall of the docking berths. She had taken 2 halting steps towards those stalls before she was roughly pulled back. The sneer that she'd received from Glees had her cowering and schooling her mind. She still had her half-rotten slice of Tardari squash. She needn't provoke her keeper's ire on such a thing as food. It wasn't as though she could afford it anyway. So, they walked. She kept her eyes down until they were queued up into a line to leave the shuttle bay. At the floor was a small vent, the cover long since broken off. She watched a small creature dart in, dark fur, clutching a sliver of dried meat in its tiny mouth. Briefly, she wondered what it would be like to be as free as that rodent. But then it was Gleese's turn at the front of the line.
Glees Gronthal,
he said to the Grundari woman at the stall beside the exit.
Good afternoon, Mr. Gronthal,
the attendant said in a bored tone.
Please state your reason for visiting Abnethel Station, duration of visit, any fruits or vegetables you have on your person.
She didn't even look up from her computer as she went through her lines.
Shuttle repair. Pirates,
he said with a shrug.
The dockmaster told me it'll take a month or two.
He let Neela go to lean his bulk on the wall, a crooked smile oozing onto his face.
As for the fruits and veg, I got a big old tardari squash in my pants if you want to inspect me.
At his remarks, the woman finally looked up, disgust warring with professionalism.
This station is a sealed arcology, she deadpanned. Outside produce is a detainable offense. Please walk into the scanner if you have nothing to claim.
Neela, who had been practicing not existing, perked up at this. Using the dexterity born of moving with the express interest of never being noticed, she pulled out her stowed meal. It slipped easily into Uncle Gleese's back pocket just as he walked into the alcove next to the woman. It closed around him, though he kept an eye on Neela through the small window. She wasn't sure what would happen, but was delighted when it buzzed red. Gleese looked up in confusion, and Neela ran. Like the rodent she envied, she scurried into the nearby vent, crawling into the confined space. A string of curses followed her, and she felt something grip her foot. Looking back, she found Gleese's fat arm filling up the vent behind her. Thankfully, the several sizes too large shoe came free without issue, and she kept crawling. She hurried to a crossroads in the ducting. Left, right, and down were the options on offer, and, as with so many other things in her life, she didn't get to have a choice. Pain racked through her, and she seized, falling forward down the vent. She couldn't even feel the vertigo of the fall through the agony. Then she hit the bottom and felt nothing at all. Neela, as a rule, didn't enjoy her dreams. They tended to feature her life, trying to make sense of the horrendous circumstances she lived through. This time, she saw a pair of unfamiliar faces. A man and a woman, Grundari, like her. Their soft features were similar to her own. At least, she thought so, based on the few chances she got to see her reflection. They smiled, looking down at her, not with the grin of avarice or the knowledge of pain yet to be inflicted, but with something warmer. In the dream, her small, chubby hand reached up at them, and then she woke up. She was still in a duct, lit only by a dim glow from a vent a little farther from where she'd slid to a stop. She felt cold and noticed a damp feeling on her forehead. Tentatively, she touched the spot, duly noting the shock of pain, then ignoring it. Looking back, she saw where the floor curved up, becoming an impossible climb. Not that she had any intention of trying to return. Instead, she continued along, her head throbbing and her stomach growling. The gate at the end hinged up, depositing her in an alleyway of some kind, which was fine by her. She crawled out, finding herself between two buildings, a decided chill in the air. There she stood for a moment as people walked by on the street. She was hurt, hungry, cold, and alone. And free. She wanted to take time to elate in that, but she needed food. At first she tried to trap some of the strange, furry vermin that occupied the alleyway with her. Creatures of that ilk had been on the slave ship, and she'd seen some of her older peers catch them. She was not, however, up to the task, weak and hurt as she was. Without other options, she had to venture out. The staggering amount of space had her goggling. This was a subspace hub station, massive so far as unmoored interstellar structures go. It had enough room for buildings to stretch upwards tens of meters before hitting the underside of the next floor up. Streets flowed around the buildings, where automated taxi services picked up and deposited people going about their lives. And then there were, of course, the people. Most were like her, but sporting well-fed faces and thick clothes that kept the bitter wind off them. She tried to, like them, get food from the stalls and hawkers that lined the streets. Most turned her away without note. One or two threatened to smack her if she didn't make room for paying customers. In the end, she managed to get a morsel from the trash of a food cart when the proprietor wasn't watching. Limping as quickly as she could, she found another alleyway to enjoy her meal. It was when she was gnawing on the butt of a cast-off Gartha root that she was kicked. Neela sprawled out on the alley floor, looking up at a trio of Grundari boys. They couldn't have been much older than she was, but they were all larger by nearly a head,
Yeah, she's the one who stole from my dad's cart,
one of them said, pointing. They advanced on her, and she didn't move. There wasn't any point. She had seen that look on their faces her entire life. Uncle Glee's, her prospective buyers, some of her fellow slaves. They looked that way when they wanted something to hurt. She couldn't even find the will to curl up into a ball. Instead, she just closed her eyes and waited. When the first meaty echo of flesh on flesh sounded through the alley, she was surprised that it didn't sting. Initially, she thought she might be too hungry, too tired, too broken to feel something as banal as pain. Then another smack. Curses. The thud of a body falling to the alley floor beside her. She opened her eyes to find two standing children squaring off with another boy. This one was human. His skin was dark, with a crop of curly black hair, dressed in a thick jacket and blue jeans. Pale purple blood smeared his knuckles as he eyed the other kids. They rushed at him, arms flailing in an uncoordinated flurry of limbs. The human sidestepped, focusing on one assault while the other attempted to clobber thin air. A quick jab to the chest had one of the Grundari boys on the ground, gasping for breath. The last one jumped on the human's back, and when it became clear he wasn't heavy enough to drag the human to the ground, painfully clear, actually, when the Grundari found himself sandwiched between a building and the human's weight. "Are you okay?" the human asked, letting the final attacker slide bonelessly to the ground. Neela didn't recognize the strange way he looked at her. He put his hand forward, but she was too weak to defend herself. Too weak, it seemed, to even get up. Instead, she just let her eyes close again, content that she lived free, even if it was just for a short while. At some point, she supposed the human killed her, because her hunger and pain disappeared like a dream from her memory. Having assumed herself dead, it surprised her to wake up. What was stranger than that? She wasn't cold, hurt, or even particularly hungry. Only daring to crack one eye a sliver, she found herself in the corner of a bright, wide, colorful room lit by a single window next to her. Some experimentation with her limbs found that she was on something astoundingly soft and under something warm. A little more investigation revealed that she was, in fact, in a bed, under a blanket. She'd been afforded such a luxury only a scant few times in her life. Usually when Uncle Glees figured it was either he gave her a blanket or a funeral. Carefully, she looked around, and then stopped. Next to her sat the human boy. He was in a chair, head lolled back, mouth open, eyes closed. Every once in a while he'd make some sort of strangled grunt sound, but he clearly hadn't noticed her waking. Slowly, she pulled herself out from under the covers, noticing a twinge of pain from her arm. She found a needle there, which led up to a bag of clear liquid. Fear that she'd been drugged filled her, but subsided when she considered how good she felt, reasoning that her new captors were trying to get her addicted to something, a not uncommon tactic used with particularly uppity slaves. She removed the needle. While she was trying to figure out how best to use it as a weapon, the door to the room opened. A human woman with the same skin tone as the boy walked in carrying a tray laden with food. For a moment, the two just stared at each other. Then Neela tried to run. The room had a single window, and she began clawing at it to try and pry it open.
"Ezekiel, wake up!"
the woman shouted, putting the food down before approaching. The boy came falling into consciousness, nearly falling out of his chair.
I'm awake! I'm awake!
He said, jumping to his feet just as Neela figured out the window clasp. The woman caught Neela around the middle in a grip Grundari knew she had no chance of breaking. Instead, she stabbed with the needle she still held.
Ow! Stop that!
The woman ordered, pulling Neela into the center of the room. The boy came up and held her attacking arms. Neela struggled a bit longer, but knew her escape attempt failed, and soon just dangled, defeated. "I'll take that." The woman plucked the needle from Neela's fingers before depositing the limp girl back onto the bed. "Zeke, keep an eye on her while I get some disinfectant on these." She motioned at the lightly bleeding wounds. "Maybe try to get her to eat something. I'll be right back." The woman left them then. "Hey, I'm glad to see you're feeling better," Ezekiel said, moving to pick the tray of food up, but keeping Neela in view. While another attempt at the window crossed her mind, she figured the human would be more than up to the task of stopping her. Instead, she hunkered in the corner of the bed furthest from the boy. "My name's Ezekiel Mundra, but everybody calls me Zeke. And my mom's name is Sindra. She used to be a Marine. She taught me how to fight. Dad is Mohammed. You haven't met him yet, but he's pretty nice. He's just boring. He works at the human embassy on the station doing, something. It revolves around passports and immigration, I think. Tried to explain it to me once and I fell asleep, like, right away. He just kept talking, and Neela found the excitement and eagerness to tell her everything about his life very odd. It was also strangely relaxing. Before she'd even realized, she'd snuck forward and grabbed some of the bright orange Gartha root from the tray to nibble on. Ezekiel's mother, Sindra, returned a while later, arm freshly bandaged. She made it clear several times that nobody would hurt her while she was in their home. Neela didn't believe them, but it was hard to run away when the room was warm and the food was fresh. She didn't mind if they eventually started beating her, as long as she was allowed to stay a bit longer. Except they never raised a hand to her, even when she did. Ezekiel tried to take one of her snacks once while teaching her how to spell. She'd bitten him and proceeded to guard her food more closely. To her surprise, Sindra just said that was a normal thing to see from somebody who grew up with food insecurity. After a week, she was comfortable enough to venture out of her room, where she was introduced to so much. Ezekiel wanted her to join him in his martial arts practice, video games, board games, schooling, when he baked with his dad. If there was a chance to drag her into something, Ezekiel took it. Neela resisted at first. That was a lot. But after another week of being offered, she joined in, cautiously, experimentally. And by a month, she sat beside Ezekiel every day during his online classes, sat for supper at the table, and played with the family in the evening. She actually surprised herself when she laughed for what seemed like the first time. The family went out to dinner to commemorate the event. They even ended the night with a Santa picture at the local mall, which Neela was too overfull of naan-bread to argue about. Even after a month and a half, it was a rare instance that they could coax Neela out into the station. One such excursion explained why. Mohammed, Ezekiel, and Neela ventured into the administration district for a last-minute holiday errand. Neela only agreed to come along for the snow. At this time in the galactic census year, the station bureaucrats were trying to conserve power between annual fuel rod exchanges. For the past several weeks, they'd been reducing the ambient heat output to help acclimate their denizens. This led to many of the levels being quite a bit colder. The humidity from water reservoirs would then condense and fall as snow instead of rain. While most Grundari considered this an infringement on their rights to leave their warm homes, the human families found it a delightful treat. Neela, who'd only recently experienced rain, now viewed snow with wonder while bundled up under a dozen layers. The street they walked was mostly empty, save a few humans and some very brave, well-insulated Grundari. One looked more like a nearly spheroid collection of sweaters and jackets, with a bit of purple skin peeking out than a sapien. The street itself was lightly coated in snow. Intricate swirls formed in the blanket of white from the passing autocab airwakes. Stopping at as unassuming a building as feasible, Ezekiel's father turned to the pair.
I'll be in there for 10 minutes.
He cast a thumb at the plain isocrete structure.
You two stay out of trouble. I don't want to see a lineup of snowmen across the street or anything, all right?
Mohammed ordered, though a slight grin ticked at the edge of his mouth. Ezekiel snapped a playful salute to his father, and Neela attempted the same. Satisfied, he hurried into the building. "I have 10 minutes to show you how to make a snowman," Ezekiel declared, squatting down to collect snow. Neela followed, watching the process as he packed a ball and began rolling it along the walkway. "Go over there and start making a ball, like this. We need 3 to put one together." She nodded, looking to the undisturbed snow by the corner of the building. Eager to get started, she hurried over and began packing the snow with her mittened hands.
Neela!
Came a voice that slid like ice and oil down her spine. She looked up at the over-bundled Grundari, leaning against the building.
I thought you were dead. Imagine my surprise when I got a ping from your brand on my wrist unit just walking by. That's what I get, I suppose. These cheap versions have such a short range.
Glees oozed around the corner, reaching down to grab Neela. She fell back, her guts going cold. The idea of returning to the pens, the hunger, the fear, those jagged comforts of her past, reflected poorly in the light of the last few weeks. Could she survive that now? Having known actual care, a full belly, the warmth of arms that wouldn't conceive of causing her pain.
Ugh!
Glee shouted as a snowball exploded on his face, making him reel back a step. Ezekiel rushed up, pulling Neela behind him. Humans were, on average, larger than Gundari. Still, Ezekiel was a boy, only a bit older than Neela, and Glees was an adult who had no qualms about displaying violence to those smaller than him.
You stay away from Neela!
Ezekiel shouted, standing his ground despite being dwarfed by Glees.
I don't mind a 2-for-1 deal.
The blubbery cretin laughed. He lunged at Ezekiel, who jumped back, dragging Neela along. With the shove, Neela fell further away, and Ezekiel kept dancing around the wide, slow, swinging blows. Glees was bigger, and Ezekiel faster, but there was one other edge the massive Gundari held. He knew how to take advantage of an unfair situation. And when the fight, such as it was, put Glees between two children, he turned and grabbed at Neela. In a rush to come to Neela's aid, Ezekiel didn't see the sucker punch coming. Glees threw back an arm, catching the boy in the face, sending him sprawling into the snow. To ensure his victory, Glees fell, landing his considerable bulk on the little human. Ezekiel let out a whoof of air, then groaned in pain, unmoving even as Glees pulled himself up.
Scrappy.
He chuckled.
I think I'll use the money I get from selling Neela to buy you a fresh brand. Gonna have to keep you on a short leash for a while, but you'll make a nice
Much to her own surprise, Neela had jumped onto Glees and sunk her teeth into his ear. He crushed her against the building, and she gasped out in pain, falling to the snowy walkway. He reared back to give Neela a final kick when,
Hey!
Mohammed came out of the office building, running with murder in his eyes. Glees, not wanting something even remotely close to an actual fight, dove into the nearest hovercab. It sped away as the man slid to a stop, checking on his kids. Ezekiel groaned, getting to his hands and knees, shaky but largely unharmed. Neela just stared blankly at the fleeing hovercar, tears streaming down her face. After a quick trip to the local infirmary, the family was back home. A report filed with the authorities, but little was likely to come of it. An attempt was made to cheer the kids up, but a pall of silence fell over the house. Neela felt as though she had been cast back to the first day of her stay with the Mundras. Fear suffused her. Terror that this was all a tenuous, thin position that might well be snatched away in the moment of weakness. Even Ezekiel's easy smile and funny jokes were more stressed, a little too forced. He had sampled the all-consuming nightmare that was Neela's life, and it had marked him. That silent shadow followed them for the next week. It showed in unobtrusive ways. Neither child wanted to leave the house, and when the matter was forced, a parent constantly stayed within arm's reach. Dinners around the table were quieter, evening games more perfunctory. Ezekiel put in a lot of effort. He practiced martial arts with his mother even more vigorously, always coming away gasping and sweating. It was always him who proposed what games to play, feigning eagerness to teach Neela the rules. It was his hand Neela would fall asleep holding, and he never complained. Neela was trying to, but some subtle hope of hers was broken now. Over that week, she didn't smile or cry or laugh. Ever vigilant, ever wary, her head on a swivel for each little noise or sudden move, it was almost a relief when on the eve of the family gift celebration, the shadow came for a visit. Neela was dressed for bed, sitting beside Ezekiel as he went through a children's book, teaching her what words meant and sounded like. A knock on the door had her bolt upright, tense, ready to run. Who could that be? Sindra asked as her husband rose to find out. He looked through the peephole first, a habit he'd developed only over the past week.
It's my boss,
Mohammed said in surprise, stepping back to open the door. A short human stood in the doorway, shin pale and gray hair thinning.
Mr. Tachibana.
What brings you here at this hour?
I am sorry to disturb your family so late,
Mr. Tachibana said, bowing slightly as he stepped inside.
A matter of some delicacy has been brought to the embassy's attention.
He looked back through the door, and Neela stopped breathing. Glees strutted in. He had traded his mountain of layers for a Gundari business suit. The attempts to polish himself only went so far, as the cheaply printed suit was already bursting at the seams. Neela wanted to take comfort in the fact that Ezekiel jumped up immediately between her and Glees. His mother jumped up a breath after guarding both children while knuckles popping sounded from Muhammad's clenched hand. She was too busy screaming inside.
Mr. Grunthal has filed a claim that you've kidnapped his niece,
Mr. Tachibana said, handing Muhammad a piece of paper.
The validity of his claim is still being processed, checking birth certificates, the Gundari family registry, guardianship licenses, and the like. Should take about a week to check for any irregularity. The man sounded dubious at best, but also very displeased. Neela knew for a fact that she didn't have a birth certificate. She wasn't on any registry. She also doubted that Glees would spend the money to actually get forgeries that would pass any true scrutiny. That he had an avaricious grin cutting across his face had her very, very worried. While the papers are being processed, Neela stays with me,
he said, pressing into the room, shoving Mr. Tachibana to the side. Mohammed stepped forward, tense with unrealized violence. His boss put a hand on his arm, staying what was likely to be a murder if left unchecked.
Gundari law is the law of the land on this station. Any unclaimed child belongs in the custody of the challenging party, which is me.
He's right, Mohammed.
The bone-deep sorrow in Mr. Tachibana's voice mirrored Neela's heart.
Unless you have some kind of legal claim to the girl,
She's my daughter!
Mohammed roared, shocking everybody in the room. Glees even taking a step back before recovering.
I don't care how loud you shout,
Glees said, tugging at the lapels of his suit in a vain attempt at nonchalance.
The law says I get her. Neela, come here now!
Neela?
Mohammed said, moving back into the room.
We can't let you go without one last human tradition.
Opening a gift on Christmas Eve is something every child should get to do. Here, Sindra and I got this for you. Mohammed kneeled down, handing a colorfully wrapped box to the numbly staring little girl. It was thin, but wide and tall like a book. You take your time opening that, my love.
I don't have time for this,
Sleaze grouched, stomping into the room. Take another step, Sindra said, moving to meet the invading Gundari, every bit the warrior she used to be. Glees wasn't so stupid as to challenge a human who was so eagerly got in his way.
Please, Sindra.
Mr. Tachibana stepped up to come between them.
I know what Mohammed makes. As satisfying as I'm sure it would be, the legal fees would ruin your family.
While they postured, Neela opened her gift. Under the wrapping was a framed piece of paper and a photo. Neela and Ezekiel sitting on Santa's lap, and a document that read,
Adoption.
Neela whispered, tears streaming down her face, splashing on the official certificate of adoption she held in her hands.
What?
Glees said, looking past Sindra. We officially adopted her a week ago. Mohammed stood, turning to look at his boss. That constitutes a pretty substantial claim, I'd argue.
I'm inclined to agree,
Mr. Tachibana said, a smile spreading onto his face.
I don't believe this!
Glees shouted.
Neela, get over!
He stopped moving when Sindra grabbed the front of his suit, raising her fist in threat.
You can't! I'll sue!
Glees choked out.
Oh, you know what?
Mr. Tachibana said, backing away.
I'll cover the lawyers. Merry Christmas, Sindra. Just not in front of the kids, please.
A smile that had nothing to do with merriment or cheer spread across the face of Neela's new mother as she bodily pulled Glees outside. Neela cried and smiled to the sound of her nightmare being destroyed by her new family.